a lot of things to remember in this thing. Okay, and so here is the spoiler, a terrarium. Yeah. And the terrariums were all a craze in the 1970s, and many of us probably have played around with terrariums in our time. But that's, how it got to the 1970s is a much longer story, and that's what I want to talk about. So in any play, you have to set the stage. And so the stage set, what was life like in the world of the 1820s to the 1840s? Well, first of all, the age of discovery, when European nations were traveling the world, kind of was winding down in the 18th century, but there were still people exploring. James Cook had traveled around the world, and so there were still explorers going around. But a lot of the parts of the world had been visited already. The other part of the story, the other part of the stage, is that the Industrial Revolution was in full force. And all the impacts of that, the early Industrial Revolution, were being felt in London, where the story is going to start, and in other European cities. And there was just belching of smoke. It was pollution in the air. It was a lot of inequality at the time as well. You read Charles Dickens, you know what he was writing about, life during the Industrial Revolution. It was also about to begin the Victorian age, the great age of art industry that Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, fostered in their reign. It was also an age of imperial expansion of the European nations, Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and later the US, and the colonization. And this is a story about imperialism and colonization. And you'll hear what that means. So Act 1, the experiment and the invention. So you'll get a quick, you'll learn very quickly about what this was. The experiment, Nathaniel Ward, his name will be very familiar when we're done. In the summer of 1829, he placed some soil, a pupa of a sphinx moth, and some dry leaves in a wide mouth bottle, and he fastened the lid. Here's a pupa of a sphinx moth there. Condensation formed on the glass and slid down the edges of the soil. Okay, you know about terrariums now. The moth hatched, and he observed some specks of green sprouting from the soil. And the plants, so he removed the moth from the jar, he resealed the bottle, and he placed it on the north-facing window in his study. And the plants that grew were a fern, Dryopteryx felix moss, and meadowgrass. The plants lived untouched in that bottle for 3 years, without any watering or anything like that. Eventually, they died because the lid rusted and rainwater got in and they rotted. But he repeated the experiment with a different kind of fern. Ferns were all a craze during the Victorian era, what's called the filmy fern. And that survived in the bottle for 9 years. So, a little bit about Nathaniel Ward. He's a very ingenious person. He was a medical doctor by training, but his really great passion was natural history and botany. He inherited his father's medical practice in Whitechapel, which is in London, and a quarter mile away his house was located in Wellclose Square, shown here in this bottom picture. And the house was just up the road from the London docks and the factories that were belching smoke out into the air. And as a doctor and as a scientist, he could see the impacts of the pollution on his patients and on his beloved ferns. So Nathaniel Ward was passionate about plants. He collected ferns, mosses, primroses, wood sorrels from the woods around London. He built a rock wall. He planted it into the rock wall. He perforated pipe behind the wall so that rainwater would drain behind and irrigate them. But then they died because of the air pollution. So he took one of those ferns that looked pretty dead, he put it in a bottle and it sprang back to life. So he was pretty convinced that he had discovered something pretty important. So he asked himself this simple question: what were the conditions necessary for plant growth? The bottle created a microenvironment. He recognized that. And that microenvironment allowed the air to be free of the soot of the factories. It allowed light to enter, and it maintained a warm temperature, kept moist, and it was kept moist through condensation on the glass. He experimented with his home. He wasn't the first to kind of understand some of this. It had been studied back in the 18th century. But it was just about 25 years before this that somebody, a Swiss chemist, realized that plants need more than what they get from the minerals and nutrients in the soil. They need something from the air, and that was carbon. And the carbon combined with light makes carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids and lipids and everything that makes a plant alive. Following that first experiment, Nathaniel Ward grew 60 different varieties of plants under glass in various types of bottles and cases. So he spent a lot of time on studying this. Ward's home essentially became a botanical library of experiments of growing plants under glass. And this is a fern case, and also growing moss. He loved mosses and he loved ferns. He just loved those plants. And here's a little more ornate case that he had in his home. He experimented with day length by putting blankets over these cases and seeing how day length affected their growth. He had numerous glass cases on his windowsills. They had a base of timber or iron, and they were covered with a glass frame and constructed in various shapes and sizes. And these are the precursors of the modern terrarium. So his house was really a botanical wonderland, and he received many scientists who were very interested in what he was doing. And through his letters to scientific societies and journals, other experimenters started to confirm what he had found. So what happens next? Plants have been shipped around the world for a long time. And, you know, seeds can be transported, but some seeds don't stay viable. And so and the sea voyages in those days were months and months at a time. So he was able to keep plants alive in these cases. And they wanted to be able to, because this was colonization and imperial expansion, they wanted to be able to gather plants from other parts of the world. So proof of concept voyage was the next step. So how do you keep plants alive on a ship, a sailing ship, for 5 or 6 months at sea? If you put them below deck, they don't have enough life. If you put them above deck, they get salt spray on them. Yeah, and the temperature fluctuations. And before he came up with this invention, barely 1 in 20 plants would make it back alive. After he invented this, 1 in 20 would die. So he just completely changed the equation. Now, so collecting and transporting had been going on for centuries. In 1500 BC, the Egyptians transported boswellia trees from East Africa for the frankincense in the bark. So, you know, this has been done for a while. And there was a boswellia plant. Earlier cases were open to the sea spray and widely fluctuating temperatures of the sea. And, you know, the sailors didn't really know how to take care of plants. They weren't gardeners or horticulturists. So they kind of ignored the plants and they just kind of went along for the ride. And most of them died. Okay. So to transport plants around the world, you really need a network of connections. And he'd already promoted his idea to a scientific and gardening community that was really ready to listen to what he was talking about. So Nathaniel Ward, through his participation in several learned societies, the Linnaeum Society was one, and the Society of Apothecaries. Now, apothecaries in those days were chemists. They were the pharmacists, okay? And the doctors were the pharmacists. They're the ones that distributed the medications. And most of those medications came from plants. So all doctors in those days had to know botany. So that's, and he loved botany anyway, but he was a member of the Society of Apothecaries and the Linnaeum Society. So he was also a friend of some other people around London, and most notably was George Lottage's of Lottage's and Sons Nursery, which had a 15-acre nursery right there in London. There's George right there. So he had networked with scientists, they'd networked with the nursery people. And what came out of this was what's called what Nathaniel Ward called the closely glazed case, but what has come to be known as the Wardian case, named after Nathaniel Ward. And this was his drawing of the original traveling, not a decorative ornamental case, but a traveling case that you could transport plants on ships. Now, there had been earlier cases that were used, and here's one by John Bothingill, a box built in the 1770s. And you can see it's just a box with a frame over the top and then just mesh. It is completely open to the elements. And so many plants would not survive traveling at sea in that kind of a case. So the Wardian case. So the voyage was, they're not going to do a little voyage. They're going to do the biggest voyage possible. This is going to really put it to the test. So George Lottage's and Nathaniel Ward, they packed 2 Wardian cases with ferns, mosses, and grasses. They took them to a Captain Charles Mallard of the Bark. It's a sailing ship, type of sailing ship, the Bark Persian. And the Bark Persian was about to leave on the longest sailing voyage known at the time, from London to Sydney, Australia. 6 months at sea to get there. So in July, and this is kind of what a bark might look like, and this happens to be a replica of the Endeavour, but there were some like that. And in those days, all of the plants in these cases that were traveling around the world were placed on the rear deck, what's called the poop deck in sailing jargon. And that's, as you can see, definitely exposed to all the elements on the stern of the ship. So they prepared these 2 Wardian cases and their botanical contents, and they were going to endure 6 months sitting there on the poop deck of these. So they sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean, stopped off in Tasmania, spent a month in Tasmania, went on to Sydney, delivered the plants to the Sydney Botanic Garden, and let's see if I got this right, yeah, 1833 they left London, January of 1834, 6 months later they arrived in Sydney, and the plants were all alive except for one little fern that had died. And the director of the Botanic Garden wrote back to Lottage's and Ward and said, they're alive and flourishing. And now I'd like to share an excerpt from the book. The book is called The Wardian Case. The Wardian Case. And this excerpt is about the return voyage. Because it's very interesting what the plants. So on the return voyage, they packed some Australian plants from around the around Sydney into the boxes, the 2 Wardian cases, and they sailed back on the Persian. So when the ship laden with colonial produce sailed in late May of 1834, the temperature in Sydney hovered between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The 2 glazed cases were again placed on the poop deck. By the time the Persian rounded Cape Horn, sailing east, there was a foot of snow covering the deck. and the temperatures had fallen to 20 degrees. When the ship called at Rio de Janeiro, the temperature was on the rise, reaching nearly 100. And it continued to rise as the vessel crossed the equator. By the time the Persian arrived at the English Channel, the temperature was down to 40 degrees, barely above freezing. The fluctuation in temperatures was a considerable test for the plants inside the cases. 6 months after leaving Sydney on November of 1834, the Persian landed in London. Upon hearing that the ship had arrived, both Ward and Lottages made their way to the docks. When they boarded the ship and looked inside, Lottages was overwhelmed with delight. The plants were in the most healthy and vigorous condition. And it mentions the type of plants that were made, and they concluded the experiment was a success. And it was, one more quote here, to just so that everyone is clear. He spoke to the spoke to the British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in 1837 in Liverpool, and they showcased his invention, and he said this about. Okay, and it says he also used the occasion to clarify a growing misconception about sealing of the cases. Quote, in no instance have I ever endeavored to seal the cases hermetically. It would, I conceive, be almost impossible to do it, and if done, would prevent that continued change of air from its alternate expansion and contraction, upon which, in my opinion, the success of the plan mainly depends. So they weren't sealed tight. They had some air exchange. Okay. So with that, those voyages of concept, the proof of concept, the chances for this to expand is great, and they did exponentially, really. But it took some influential friends, and one of those friends, William Cavendish, the Duke of Devonshire. And the name Cavendish, some of you may know that name for a crop that we consume almost daily. We'll get to that a little bit later. And he built a greenhouse in the 1830s on his property in Devon. And here's just a picture of, the amazing greenhouse that a rich lord of England could build. And he brought in many, let's see, and he brought in a lot of plants from India that are transported in Wardian cases. The other person that was very influential was William Hooker. He was a professor of botany at Glasgow University in Scotland, and he became the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. And we'll get back to the Kew in a minute because it plays prominent in the use of Wardian cases. And Hooker even named an aquatic moss from the Cape Colony in Africa after Wardia hygrometrica. So there's a little kind of moss, let's say. He also gave a talk at the British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in 1837 in Liverpool, and I read the quote a little bit ahead on that. Between 1839 and 1841 is when the name Wardian case became to be known. So a little bit about Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. It's a 326-acre UNESCO World Heritage Site just north of London, a little part of town called Richmond. Let's see, it has an amazing plant collection, 27,000 taxa living plants, 8.3 million plant and fungal herbarium specimens, over 40,000 species in its seed bank. And William Hooker became the director of this. So beginning in 1842, William Hooker started using these Wardian cases to ship plants in and out of Kew, and that increased dramatically over the years. Also in 1842, oh, just a little bit more about Kew, the Palm House filled with palms, the Temperate House, there's many other houses there on the site. And I think when I visited there, it's been 20 years now, when I visited there, the Princess of Wales Conservatory was the most amazing thing because it has 10 ecological zones that are all individually monitored, and plants from all those ecological zones are represented in that house. So it's an amazing place to visit. If you ever get around London, take a day and visit Kew. It's amazing. In 1842, Ward published his book, his first edition of his book, on the growth of plants in closely glazed cases. That's what he called them, closely glazed cases. But they've come to be known as Wardian cases since then. Next came what we refer to as the Science at Sea expeditions. And these were expeditions that were scientific expeditions that were started, that were from the French, the British, and the Americans. And they basically wanted to go to the Southern Hemisphere and collect plants because they were so unique to the Northern Hemisphere, and to bring them back to Kew and to bring them back to the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard and the French back to Paris was really, what they endeavored to do. And you can see this is I'm going to just highlight the U.S. exploring expedition from 1838 to 1842. So 4 years they traveled, and there was about 6 or 7 ships, hundreds of men, a big scientific group on board. It's called the Wilkes expedition after the captain. And you can see they started off in New York, across to the Azores, around the eastern side of South America. They tried to go down to Antarctica, didn't quite make it, went up the west coast of South America, back across, but they finally did make it within sight of Antarctica. And I think that might have been the first ships to get that close to Antarctica. They also went all the way back through Hawaii to the Pacific Northwest. And they sailed and mapped up and down the Oregon, California, Washington coast, went inland up the Columbia River, and they found some very interesting plants. And it says here that they returned to the United States with 1,100 live plants in Wardian cases. And those plants became the founding collections for the U.S. Botanic Garden. Artifacts became the founding artifacts for the Smithsonian Institute and for the National Herbarium. So this was really the last great sailing expedition that took place in the world, was this Wilkes expedition of 4 years. And they sailed around the world doing it. It was the last world by a naval world sailing around the world by naval group, naval ships. Okay, so they did find this one is really an amazing plant. The California pitcher plant. It's a carnivorous plant, Darlingtonia californica, and it was found, and they collected it up at the headwaters of the Sacramento River. Back before there was Shasta Dam and all that kind of stuff. There was aquatic habitat up there. There is now in just near Florence, Oregon, a preserve that is the only preserve in the country dedicated to a single species, to the Darlingtonia californica, and it's called Darlingtonia Preserve or something like that. So it's and so this is a very rare plant, not considered endangered because it's so rare in the wild. Okay, so let's look at some pictures of what this was all about. It's just amazing. So here are the French on the left here at this would be called translated into the test garden for the colonies. So this is where they would test out plants to plant in the colonies. And here they were packing the Wardian cases. Here at the botanical gardens at Kew in 1940, they're packing the cases. And you'll see in a few minutes that these cases were not identical. They were very individual type of things, but they're all based on the same principle, sealed, not hermetically sealed, but sealed and allowing light to reach the plants. So here's some, and this is where you really see the colonization effect of European nations. So this was the Dutch East Indies in Indonesia. And here are Wardian cases there. Here is this is the Garden of Tropical Agriculture in Paris in 1910. Here's the Missouri Botanical Gardens. They were packing cycads in 1920, and you can see one here that is not tarp, but these have tarps on them. Imagine it might have been from cold weather, and they just were protecting them until they got them into the greenhouse. Here is the Dominica Botanic Garden in the Caribbean. It was a US colony at the time with more Wardian cases. Well, Royal Botanic Gardens Kew became very active, of course, in using the Wardian cases. And they even developed a case that could be broken down and strapped together as a flat, what they call a flat pack. So they could ship this without the plants, put it back together, put the plants in it, and ship those back to Britain. And between the years 1842 and 1865, when William Hooker was the director at Kew, they shipped about 400 plants, 400 boxes of Wardian cases into Kew, and almost that many were sent out from Kew to the colonies. And you can see where some of them are coming. They got a lot of plants from Australia and a lot of plants from Japan, some from South America, Hawaii, but they sent a lot of plants to India, as you would expect the British would do, a lot of plants to Australia and to New Zealand. Now, there are some very important economic plants that were transported in Wardian cases and distributed throughout the world. I'm going to give 5 examples here for you. First one, the Cavendish banana. Okay, and this is the banana that we get in the marketplace. It's been domesticated by native people for thousands of years in Asia, New Guinea, where it's native. So this is just the distribution of native plants all over the world for economic purposes. It was brought to Britain from Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and it was asexually propagated by William Cavendish, head gardener, and formerly it was named after Cavendish, but we took that name away from him. And why was it asexually propagated? Because, you know, when you eat a banana, you don't get a seed. There are no seeds in bananas, in the Cavendish banana. They are what in botany we say are parthenocarpic. In other words, they produce fruit without seeds. And there are, you know, seedless grapes and seedless this and that. So there are some other plants that don't have, that are parthenocarpic as well. The clones that were produced by Cavendish and Gardner, and also at Kew, were distributed throughout the South Pacific, Hawaii, Africa, Central and South America. You know, bananas grow, you know, in South America, Central America, but they're not native, not the Cavendish. Tea. Okay, we all love to have our morning tea, Camellia sinensis. This one's an interesting one too, because not only do you need the plants, but you need to know how to process the leaves. So, you know, you have to know how to dry and ferment them. So it required both the plant and the process. And Robert Fortune, another Brit, made 4 expeditions to Yunnan province, you know, where COVID came from. So that's where tea came from too. And he brought both plants and the process. Some Chinese, at the time that he did this, China had the world monopoly on tea. And it was getting rather expensive to buy tea from China. So the British wanted to establish tea plantations in India. And so they brought the plants and the knowledge of how to process tea into for beverage purposes to Calcutta, and then to Darjeeling and to Assam, where we're familiar with those names. But there was a lot of failure transporting seedlings. So what he did uniquely, because they're very oily seeds growing in Australia, I'm a landscaper, and so what he did is because the seedlings weren't transporting very well in the cases, so he planted some small mulberry trees in the Hoardian cases. He scattered some tea leaves on the soil, at the top of the soil. He put an inch of soil over the top of the tea seeds, the seeds of the tea, and he closed the cases, and he shipped them from to Calcutta. And when they arrived in Calcutta, the tea seedlings were sprouting and were healthy. So he discovered kind of another way around using the Hoardian case, not growing, not transporting the plants themselves, but germinating the seeds in the cases as they were being transported. So everybody was adapting to the use of the Hoardian case in a different way. And fortune was, he brought back daphnes and magnolias and rhododendrons and roses and jasmine and wisteria. They were collecting all sorts of stuff. It's not, just these economic plants, but many, many different ornamental plants. Cinchona, okay, Cinchona officinalis is in the coffee family, so it's related to coffee. It's native to the wet montane forests from Colombia to Bolivia. And why is it important? Because it contains quinine for the prevention and treatment of malaria. And in these years, malaria was the #1 killer in the tropical colonies of the British and the French. And to have quinine that gave them the ability to remain healthy and govern in those colonies. So this was the most sought after economic plant in the world in the mid-19th century, was cinchona. Another important economic industrial plant, rubber. We know that's so important. It's the source of natural rubber, but the latex that's tapped from the hevea trees is a very unstable product, and it's easily loses its shape. It becomes brittle when cold, and it was really just a curiosity until 1839 when the process of vulcanization was discovered. The oily seeds were difficult to transport. The British took a few seeds back to Kew, and they sprouted. A few of the seeds sprouted at Kew, and those seedlings they then shipped to their colonies in Southeast Asia. So rubber native to South America, shipped to Southeast Asia. And the Brazilian rubber industry collapsed after leaf flight was introduced into South America and is no longer a viable industry. Chocolate, cacao, again, transported in Hoardian cases, native to southern Mexico, to the Amazon. But where is most of it grown? West Africa. That's where most of it's grown. All of it taken in Hoardian cases and established on those colonies. So you might have guessed from what I've said so far that this wasn't all really peaches and cream. There were some tragedies involved in the use of these cases. Act 4 then is the tragedies that were unleashed by the Hoardian case. Over collection of rare plants was one of the big problems. And here are just two that were collected from Southeast Asia that are on the endangered species list now. This orchid on the left is what's called a Venus, not a Venus flytrap, but a Venus slipper orchid. This is a pitcher plant, also beautiful. These carnivorous pitcher plants are amazing, but now very endangered in the wild. Another tragedy, invasive plants. Okay, so Hoardian cases brought Japanese honeysuckle to the United States, and that is a noxious invasive weed in parts of the country. And here, Lake Pend Oreille has yellow flag iris growing, also transported in Hoardian cases and now released into the wild. And an invasive species in our own neighborhood. Invasive worm. This shovelhead planarian worm is a predatory worm that eats earthworms and other macrofauna in the soil. And it was transported in the soil. Of course, you think there's plants, there's soil. There's all sorts of opportunities for pests and diseases to get transported, soil and plant-borne. And this one was established in many parts of the world. And it's very difficult to get rid of a soil pest like that. Here's one, an insect, grape phylloxera. An interesting story with grape phylloxera. American grape species are essentially aren't bothered by it. They're resistant to it. But the European grape, the wine grape, is very sensitive, and the French wine industry was essentially wiped out by the introduction of grape phylloxera in the early 20th century, and had to rebuild by grafting European grapes onto American grape rootstocks. So, and California had to do that too. Washington wine industry grows all of their grapes on European wine grape roots. So, and the phylloxera has been moving north with climate change. It's already in Oregon, and at some point, all of the vineyards are going to have to be replanted with grafted vines with American grape rootstocks. I think that's going to happen in the next 20, 50 years. Okay, so pests, and I'm just giving you a few examples. There's more. The list is longer than this. Plant diseases. Okay, Phytophthora root rot infects avocados and bananas, citrus, potatoes, raspberries. Came in the soil in Wardian cases. Chestnut blight came in Wardian cases and has essentially killed all of the American chestnuts. And it came with Japanese chestnuts. The South American leaf blight fungus devastated the Brazilian rubber industry. There's a coffee rust fungus that came in Wardian cases. But the one that's closest to us is the white pine blister rust. And this came in 1910 in a shipment of eastern white pines from France to British Columbia in Wardian cases. And then the rust spread around the Pacific Northwest, and we have it killing our 5-needle pines here, the western white pine and the white bark pine. So again, transported in Wardian cases. Well, there is a sort of redemption to all this tragedy that the Wardian cases have brought. They have brought insect enemies for biological control of pests. So they started, the entomologists started thinking, hey, we don't have chemicals to control these pests. Let's bring natural enemies. And so here are some, and I'll mention this cactus moth in a minute, but in Texas, they were transporting insect enemies of the cactus moth. And here in Lahore, India, they're transporting enemies of the citrus whitefly. And did I get to see that I've got? Oh, natural enemies. Yeah, that's what I was waiting for. So the cottony cushion scale is a scale insect that infects citrus and other trees as well. And it was essentially, killing all the citrus trees in California in the 1880s. And so what they did is they imported from Australia Novius ladybugs that are just voracious eaters of cottony cushion scale. So that was an example of bringing a natural enemy for biological control in a Wardian case. The South American cactus moth. Well, the Australians thought, oh, cactus is pretty good, so we'll bring it from the Americas and we'll plant it. They did that in the I think it was like in about the 1780s. They were planting it for fodder for livestock. I don't know how they eat that, but anyway, fodder for livestock and for ornamental and as the edible fruit of the. So, but the cactus just overran wherever it was planted. And so they brought in the South American cactus moth to control and it essentially has wiped out the prickly pear in Australia as an invasive species. The problem now with the cactus moth is that it has gotten up into Florida and is moving west, and it is endangering our own native cacti. So it was a great South American. There were many enemies to the cactus moth in Argentina where it came from, but none up north here where cactus grows. So it's a complicated world, and we still haven't figured out exactly how to take care of it well. So that kind of is the 5 acts. Now, just a short epilogue. Okay, so what happened to Nathaniel Ward through all of this? Well, there was a great exhibition, and it was called the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry and of all Nations in 1851 in London, in Hyde Park. And the Crystal Palace was this constructed, of course, this is Queen Victoria and Prince Albert are really promoting art and industry. And Wardian cases were exhibited at this great exhibition. And interesting, just for those of you who like literature and famous names, the authors in attendance included Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, and Lewis Carroll. And the judges of the competition were Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Michael Faraday. So it was the leading writers and the leading scientists of the day. I don't know if he won anything for that, but at that point. He also became a board member of the Chelsea Physic Garden. Now that's another interesting botanic garden in London, right next to the Thames. I visited that once, and it was managed by the Society of Apothecaries and started in the 1670s, I think. And it keeps those medicinal plants that those physicians used and other edible plants in that garden. And I think it said there's 5,000 different edibles, useful and medicinal plants that have changed the world essentially in that garden. He was elected a master of the apothecaries, and he actually organized what were called microscopic parties. And these microscopic parties shown here in the lower right, with a Wardian case kind of centered there, were teaching about science education. So that's what he was doing. He was more involved with showcasing education at this point. He ended up moving to another house, which had more room and more place for a garden. He built this beautiful greenhouse where he could grow his ferns and his other botanical plants. He published the 2nd edition to his book in 1852. And in the final few years of his life, he got a little disgruntled. He'd lost his wife and he'd lost several of his children already. And his time had been, he was always willing to share his time with people and tell them about how to make plants and how to make plants survive traveling and how to keep them in these closed in these Wardian cases. And he kind of got a little overwhelmed by that in his later years. So he died in 1868. The Wardian case. Well, the author of the book, Luke Keogh, traveled the world looking for Wardian cases. And the thousands and thousands of Wardian cases that were shipped all over the world, he could only find 15 left. Why were they all gone? Because the entomologists decided we need to destroy these when they arrive at their point of destination. So the soil was sterilized, the Wardian cases were burned, and that's the kind of the get rid of the source of pests and diseases. So here are 4 that are still in existence. This one down here was found in Western Australia and was being used as a doghouse. So repurposed in that way. So let's see. What was the last? Oh, the last Wardian case was shipped in 1948. 1948 by air freight. This was the last one that was shipped. And the biological control, the kind of the redemption of the Wardian case was overshadowed after World War II by the use of synthetic chemicals. So while the entomologists were thinking of biological control, the chemical companies were thinking of other things. So I hope you've enjoyed, and find that the wooden case was an important invention, and it really did make big changes in the world. If you have any questions, I'm ready. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna escape here. Go ahead, Ray.
I'm just puzzled by their, so they have wooden frames, there are the four on the left-hand side. Was there still glass then? It must, or
Which the four in the
they're wood, they're obviously suitcase-like carrying.
yeah, this one I don't understand so much how it let the light in. That one on the left, I'm not sure about.
But the one above it, so the light could come in, so that it's protecting the top, I guess, from all those
Right.
snowflakes.
And you can see by some of those photographs of the warding cases, they made them so they could be stacked, you know, so that they could, because they were shipping, you know, many. It wasn't like the two that Ward and Lottage's first ship, you know, it was many cases. It was an industry of shipping industry. And they you know, they say the container ship is the new Wardian case.
Huge box cars, huh? Oh, it's amazing. Really interesting.
Okay, any questions? Yeah, Jill.
Having cooked with a solar cooker, I'm amazed that the plants on the ships didn't get to cook. And I'm wondering if maybe some of those sailors opened them up the way that would have ruined them.
You're right. You're right. When it got hot down in the tropics, the advice was send a gardener along on these trips, because the gardener could tend for them and open them up to let some air exchange. The big problem was there was limited fresh water available on board ships in those days, and they're out for weeks and weeks at a time, and they can't take time to water plants. So they have to keep them in these closed cases so that the condensation is produced and the plants stay watered. That was the ingenuity of the whole invention, was the fact that you didn't have to water them. You might have to ventilate them occasionally, depending on the conditions, but pretty amazing results. John.
So the ventilation would have allowed carbon dioxide in?
Yeah, the question was, the ventilating would allow carbon dioxide in. Yes, but that wasn't even necessary because those cases were not hermetically sealed anyway. So there was enough air exchange that they would be getting fresh air and carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Yeah, he made that point strongly, that he felt that there was a misconception that he was sealing them tight, and that was not what he was doing. They had gaps in them. Any?
Online,
great.
Patty's saying we should bring these back into households.
That one on the right is sharp.
Oh, yeah, we should bring, yeah, there's some really beautiful ones out there. And apparently you can buy them too. So they're, you know, you go online and look for Wardian case and you'll find replicas, you know, for sale that you can use in, you know, your home. Yeah. Any other questions from Zoom?
That was it.
That is so far. Any more questions here? The book is you know, you gotta love plants and, and all, but a well-written book with lots of details. I've left out a lot of them, of course. The title is The Wardian Case: How a Simple Box Moved Plants and Changed the World, by Luke Keogh. He's an Australian, and it's a nice read. And a lot of the photographs that I've shown are in the book and more, of course. I hope everybody in Zoom could hear me fine. I tried to speak up loud. Yeah, okay, I gotta get. Yeah, you can do that.
Can you hold up the book?
Yeah. Oh, and for those.
I don't think they can see it because you have your program, right?
Let's see. What's,
This looks
huh, okay. I don't know why I'm getting that. Anyway, I hope you can see it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe we're done. Maybe we've had a successful program.
How did you come across the book?
How did I come across the book? I just was looking for information on the Wardian case, and I saw that there was a book that had been written, published, I think it was last year. I think it came out maybe in the fall or the summer. No, it was 2020 actually. No, 2020. Yeah. There's been numerous articles written about the Wardian case, so it wasn't like it was a new topic.
It deserves a book.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty.
Major. Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you.
I'm trying to. Oh, okay.